Most people assume that when a killer strikes, the story ends one of two ways. The killer gets away with it, or law enforcement catches up with them eventually. A trial, a verdict, a prison sentence. That is how justice is supposed to work. But the cases in this video did not follow that script. In each of these cases, the person who was supposed to be the victim refused that role. A woman alone in an apartment with a man who arrived carrying handcuffs and a machete in his trunk. A 17-year-old boy tied to a torture board who somehow got hold of a gun. A father in a baseball cap standing at an airport payphone. A woman pouring gasoline in the dark while her children waited in the car outside. A daughter who spent her entire childhood in a wheelchair she never needed. Two brothers who walked into a den in Beverly Hills with shotguns. Today we are covering 6 cases where the killer met their end not at the hands of law enforcement, but at the hands of the very people they thought they had power over. Neil Falls and Heather Saul. Neil. Martin Falls was born on September 24, 1969, in Eugene, Oregon. He died on July 18, 2015, in Charleston, West Virginia, shot once in the head by a woman he had come to kill. He was 45 years old. The woman who killed him was Heather Saul, a sex worker who had advertised her services online and whose address Falls had tracked down. Falls arrived at her apartment armed with a handgun and carrying, in his car outside, a collection of tools that police would later describe as a kill kit. A machete, axes, knives, a shovel, a sledgehammer, bleach, plastic bags, 4 pairs of handcuffs, a bulletproof vest, and a large plastic tote big enough to fit a human body. In his pocket was a handwritten list of 6 other women, all sex workers, all with their names, ages, and phone numbers written down. Falls had not come to Charleston for a date. He had come to kill. What made the death of Neil Falls so significant was not just that Heather Saul survived. It was what investigators found when they started pulling apart the life of the man she had just shot. Falls had been stopped by police in more than 20 states during his lifetime. He had lived in Oregon, Nevada, Indiana, Kentucky, and Texas before arriving in West Virginia. In Nevada alone, between 2003 and 2007, multiple sex workers had vanished while Falls was living and working in the area. 3 of them were later found dismembered, their remains scattered across Nevada, California, and Illinois. A handgun recovered at the scene of his death had been legally purchased in 2014. His Oregon RD was found in his pocket alongside the list of women. The FBI opened an investigation into his background almost immediately after his body was removed from Heather Saul's apartment. Investigators from multiple states began pulling cold case files. The Charleston Police Department Chief of Detectives, Steve Cooper, said publicly that it was likely Falls was a serial killer. Heather Saul had stopped him. Not police, not investigators, not the FBI. A woman alone in her apartment, fighting for her life with a rake and then with his own gun. The story of Neil Falls and Heather Saul is a story about a predator who spent years moving across the country, targeting vulnerable women, and about the one woman who refused to die. It is also a story about how little was known about him, and how much was uncovered only because he was dead. Falls had no serious criminal history, no convictions for violent offences. He had been stopped by police dozens of times across more than 20 states for traffic violations and nothing more. He existed, in the official record, as a law-abiding man who liked firearms and drove a lot. It took his death to reveal what he actually was, and even then, investigators were left working backward through years of movements, trying to piece together how many women he had killed and where he had buried them. Many of those questions remain unanswered. What is known, absolutely, is what happened on July 18, 2015, in a small apartment in Charleston, West Virginia. Falls came to kill Heather Saul. Heather Saul killed him instead. The story of how that happened, and what it revealed about the man lying dead on her floor, is one of the most striking true crime cases of the past decade. A man police believe was responsible for the deaths of at least several women, possibly many more, was stopped not by law enforcement, but by one of his intended victims, a woman who had survived hard things her entire life, and was not willing to stop surviving. The sections that follow cover his background and the life he built as he moved from state to state, the moment he arrived at Heather Saul's door, the fight that ended his life, and what investigators found when they started looking into who Neil Falls really was. The next section covers the early life and background of Neil Falls, the years he spent moving between states, and the period in Nevada that investigators would later examine most closely. Neil Falls grew up in Eugene, Oregon, the second of 10 children in a large, impoverished family. His childhood was not marked by any documented abuse or trauma in official records, but it was poor and unstable. He left high school and moved into low-skilled labor, the kind of work that does not require a permanent address or a long resume. He was not known in his early years to drink heavily or use drugs. People who knew him described him as quiet. He had an interest in firearms and military equipment that people around him noticed and remembered. He collected weapons. He read survivalist material. He was meticulous about his guns in a way he was not meticulous about much else in his life. In 2000, Falls relocated to Henderson, Nevada, a city just outside Las Vegas. He found work as a security guard at Hoover Dam, on the border between Nevada and Arizona. The job suited him. It gave him access to a uniform, a position of minor authority, and a routine that kept him busy without requiring him to form lasting relationships with people. He worked at Hoover Dam for several years. During that time, co-workers remembered him as developing a reputation for two things: an obsessive focus on firearms and survivalism in his conversations, and a habit of torturing animals. He would, according to people who knew him during this period, take animals out into the Arizona desert and abuse them severely. This detail was not uncovered until after his death, when investigators began interviewing people from his past. Also, during this period in Nevada, Falls began regularly spending time with sex workers. He frequented them, and he did so in an area where, between 2003 and 2007, multiple sex workers would disappear or turn up dead and dismembered. In 2008, Falls was forced out of his job at Hoover Dam following allegations of sexual harassment involving a female co-worker. He did not find another permanent position after that. Instead, he began a pattern that would define the final years of his life. He moved constantly, spending time in Oregon, Indiana, Kentucky, and Texas, working occasional jobs as a security guard, living without roots. Police in state after state recorded his details during traffic stops. He was stopped in Arizona, California, Colorado, Georgia, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Missouri, Montana, New Mexico, Nevada, Oregon, Texas, and West Virginia, among others. Each time, police found a man with a valid ID and no outstanding warrants. Each time, he drove away. In January 2015, two things happened that investigators would later identify as potentially significant. Falls discovered that a woman he had been seeing romantically was married. Around the same time, his mother died. People who knew him during this period said he became visibly destabilized, more internally conflicted, more disorganized in his behavior. He attended retraining courses in Oregon in April 2015 to maintain his security guard certification. By summer, he was in Texas. By late summer, he had driven to West Virginia. In the weeks before July 18, 2015, Falls arrived in Charleston, West Virginia. He was not from there. He had no documented ties to the city. What he did have was access to the internet and a willingness to search for sex workers who advertised online. He found Heather Saul on Backpage, a website commonly used at that time by sex workers to advertise their services. He made contact with her. He called her several times, 7 or 8 times by her account, asking for directions to her apartment. She said later that if he had called one more time, she would have cancelled the appointment entirely. He did not call again. Around 3 p.m. on July 18, 2015, his silver Subaru pulled up outside her building. The next section covers the moment Falls arrived at Heather Saul's apartment, the attack, and the fight that ended his life. Heather Saul was not alone when Falls arrived. 2 friends had been at her apartment earlier that day. One of them, a man named Harley, was supposed to sit on the front porch as a lookout while she met with a client, a standard safety measure she used when seeing someone new. As Falls pulled up, one of Heather's friends left to walk to a nearby grocery store for a soda. Harley was still outside. Falls got out of his car, walked to the door, and came inside. What happened next? Heather Saul described in detail to investigators and in subsequent interviews. Falls walked in and immediately pressed a gun against her side. He looked at her and said, "Live or die." She said later that the words were not delivered with obvious rage or excitement. He was calm. He said it the way someone might say good morning. She told investigators, "You could tell he was confident with what he was doing and saying. He had done it before. You could tell." She told him she wanted to live. She pleaded with him to let her breathe. He gripped her by the throat and dragged her through the apartment. He told her she was going to be quiet. She described the struggle that followed as lasting between 10 and 15 minutes. Falls had his hands around her throat for much of it. He dragged her from room to room. She fought. She screamed when she could. She grabbed a rake that was inside the apartment and used it to defend herself. The two of them wrestled, moved through the apartment, knocked things over. At some point during the struggle, Heather managed to get hold of Falls' gun. She fired one shot. The bullet entered his head. He fell to the floor. He did not get up. A neighbour on the block heard screaming from the alleyway behind her home at around 3:30 p.m. and went outside to investigate. She found Heather Saul pacing in a state of visible distress, cut and shaken. Heather told her, "A man tried to rape me and I shot him." The neighbour called 911 immediately. Police arrived to find Falls dead on the floor of Heather's apartment, a single gunshot wound to the head. Heather was still outside, visibly injured. Investigators looked at the scene and made a rapid determination. This had not been a routine client visit that went wrong. The evidence was overwhelming. The handgun Falls had pressed against Heather's side was recovered from the floor, bearing her fingerprints from when she had wrestled it away from him. Falls had arrived with 4 pairs of handcuffs in his pockets. In his car, parked outside, police found the machete, the axes, the knives, the shovel, the sledgehammer, the bleach, the plastic bags, the bulletproof vest and the large plastic tote. They found his Oregon ID. They found approximately $700 in cash. And in his pocket, alongside the handgun and the ID, they found the handwritten list. 6 women. All sex workers, all with their names, ages, and contact information drawn from back-page advertisements. Police contacted all 6 women on the list immediately. 5 were located across West Virginia. 1 was in San Diego, California. All 6 were alive. All 6 were shaken to learn that a man had written their names and phone numbers on a piece of paper and driven to Charleston, West Virginia, with a trunk full of weapons. Heather Saul was not charged with any crime. The Charleston Police Department ruled the shooting a clear case of self-defense. They called her a hero. Steve Cooper, the department's chief of detectives, said publicly that the evidence at the scene made it apparent that Falls had come to kill her and that she had saved her own life. They also said in the days that followed that they believed she may have saved the lives of the other women on that list. The next section covers the investigation into Falls' past that began after his death, the women who disappeared during his years in Nevada, and the cases investigators connected to his movements. The investigation into Neil Falls began the moment his identity was confirmed. What investigators found when they started pulling his records was a man who had been moving around the country for years, in and out of areas where women had gone missing or turned up dead, leaving behind nothing more than traffic stop records and a trail of states he had passed through. The period that drew the most immediate attention was his time in Nevada. Falls had lived in Henderson, Nevada, from approximately 2000 to around 2012. During that stretch, and particularly between 2003 and 2007, multiple sex workers vanished from the Las Vegas area. 3 of them were later found dismembered, their remains spread across different states. Misty Marie Sayans was 25 years old and working as a sex worker in Las Vegas when she went missing in March 2003. Her partial remains, wrapped in plastic and bed sheets, were discovered by 2 bikers off State Route 159 near Red Rock Canyon on March 6, 2003. She had not yet been identified at that point. It would take 2 years and DNA testing before her remains were confirmed as hers. Jody Brewer was 19 years old. She had been working toward a grant for beauty school and lost the grant, which pushed her back onto the streets. She disappeared from Las Vegas on August 14, 2003. Her torso was found in San Bernardino, California, on August 29, 2003. She had last been seen getting into a white car with California license plates. Lindsay Marie Harris was 21 years old and living in Henderson, Nevada, the same city where Falls was living and working at the time. She disappeared on May 4, 2005, after making a deposit at a bank near her home. Her rental car was later found abandoned in the desert. On May 23, 2005, a group of children found human legs in a grassy field near Interstate 55 in Divernon, Illinois, 15 miles south of Springfield. DNA testing eventually confirmed the legs belonged to Harris. The FBI had compared DNA submitted by Illinois authorities with DNA submitted by Henderson investigators, and the match was confirmed. All 3 women had worked in the sex industry. All three had advertised or found clients in ways that matched how Falls was known to seek out sex workers. All three disappeared or were found during the years when Falls was living in the Henderson and Las Vegas area. Las Vegas police and Illinois investigators had long suspected a connection between the three killings, but had never been able to identify a common suspect. After Falls died in Charleston, his name entered those investigations. Falls was not conclusively proven to have killed any of these women. No DNA evidence was recovered linking him to their deaths. No witness placed him with any of the three women before they disappeared, but the circumstantial picture was striking. He was in Nevada during all three disappearances. He was known to spend significant time with sex workers. He was fired from Hoover Dam for sexual harassment in 2008 and left Nevada shortly afterward, and the killings stopped. Nevada and Illinois law enforcement continued to examine the cases in the months after Falls died, and the FBI assisted in the review. Investigators also looked at a cluster of disappearances in and around Chillicothe, Ohio. A dozen sex workers had vanished from Chillicothe in 2014, less than a year before Falls arrived in West Virginia. Chillicothe is approximately a 2-hour drive from Charleston. Falls had been in Ohio during the period of interest. Investigators found no physical evidence linking Falls to the Chillicothe disappearances, but his name came up in the review of suspects. In 2018, 3 years after his death, Falls was tested for a possible connection to the E-70 killer, a series of murders that occurred across Indiana and Ohio in the spring of 1992. The E-70 killer targeted businesses along the Interstate 70 corridor and killed 6 people. Falls would have been 22 or 23 at the time, and investigators noted that he had been in the Midwest during that period. His age and his known presence in the region at the time overlapped with the timeline of the killings, and his physical description was broadly consistent with descriptions of the suspect. However, no physical evidence connecting Falls to the E-70 murders was found. Investigators ultimately concluded that the links were unlikely, though the case remains officially unsolved. What the investigation produced, taken together, was a picture of a man who had spent decades moving between states, spending time in areas where women who worked in the sex industry were disappearing and leaving behind no convictions, no serious charges, and no definitive evidence of what he had done. He had been in contact with police dozens of times across more than 20 states and had never been arrested for anything more serious than a traffic violation. His name was not on any watch list. He was not a registered sex offender. He was not under surveillance. He was, as far as the official record was concerned, a man with a security guard license and a collection of firearms and a habit of driving long distances. The list of 6 women found in his pocket when he died was the clearest window into what he had been planning. He had done research. He had written down names, ages, and contact information. He had a system, and he had arrived in Charleston with a car full of equipment that would have made disposing of a body significantly easier. The next section covers the aftermath of the shooting, how Heather Saul was treated by police and the public, where the case stands today, and what the death of Neil Falls left behind. Heather Saul did not try to hide what had happened. She walked out of her apartment after the shooting, found her neighbour, and told her immediately that she had killed a man who had attacked her. She cooperated fully with investigators from the moment they arrived. She described the attack in detail. She showed them her injuries. She answered every question. The Charleston Police Department cleared her of any wrongdoing quickly and without ambiguity. Their statement was direct. She had acted in self-defense. She was not going to be charged, and they considered her actions to have potentially saved the lives of the other women whose names were found in Falls' pocket. Steve Cooper, the chief of detectives, used the word hero to describe her publicly. Heather was not embarrassed about who she was or what she did for money. In interviews that followed the investigation, she addressed her drug use and her work directly. When investigators brought up her drug use while reviewing her phone records, she told them, "I have done drugs, yes, but I do not have to have them." She spoke about the reality of her life with a clarity that did not ask for sympathy or apology. She said she had fought men her entire life, and that she supposed she had always had to be ready for someone like Falls. She described what it felt like to have his hands around her throat, and to hear him tell her she was going to be quiet. She said she had asked him to please just let her breathe and that he would not. She said she knew, from the moment he walked through the door and put the gun against her side, that this was not a man who had come to pay for company. She said she could feel it. The broader public response to the case split in 2 directions. many people responded with immediate sympathy and admiration. The image of a woman in Heather Saul's position, alone in an apartment with a man who arrived with handcuffs and a machete in his trunk, and a list of victims in his pocket fighting back and winning, resonated with a lot of people. The Charleston Police Department's decision to call her a hero rather than treat her as a suspect was widely praised. True crime communities and victim advocacy groups pointed to the case as an example of the dangers faced by sex workers, who are statistically among the most at-risk groups for predatory violence and among the least likely to receive serious law enforcement attention when they are harmed. The other side of the response focused on the question of how Falls had operated for so long without being identified. He had been stopped by police in more than 20 states. He had been fired from a government-contracted position for sexual harassment. He had been living in Nevada during a period when multiple sex workers were found dismembered, and none of it had triggered any serious scrutiny of him as a potential violent offender. The women he suspected of killing in Nevada were found in pieces, and their cases remained officially unsolved for years. Their names, Misty Sayans, Jody Brewer, Lindsay Harris, did not become nationally known. Their deaths did not generate the kind of attention that might have put a man like Falls under a microscope earlier. Falls had understood, investigators suspected, that targeting women who worked in the sex industry meant targeting women whose disappearances were less likely to be aggressively investigated, and whose killings were less likely to generate sustained public pressure for a solution. The 6 women whose names were found in Falls' pocket were all contacted and confirmed to be alive. Their reactions were not made public in detail, but the fact that their names were on a list in a dead man's pocket was not something any of them would easily set aside. The murders Falls is suspected of in Nevada remain officially unsolved as of today. The Misty Sayans case, the Jody Brewer case, and the Lindsay Harris case have not been closed with a confirmed perpetrator. Falls cannot be charged, tried, or convicted of anything. He is dead. The families of those women have not received a definitive answer about what happened to their daughters, and given that Falls is gone and left behind no confession, it is possible they never will. Neil Falls left no known surviving children. He had not maintained close relationships with most of his family. The investigation into his background turned up co-workers, traffic stop records, and a security guard license. It did not turn up anyone who said they had been close to him. Heather Saul continued her life after July 18, 2015. She has spoken in interviews about the experience and about what it means to have survived something that others did not. She described her life before the encounter with Falls as one that had involved hard choices made in difficult circumstances, and she did not pretend otherwise. What she said more than anything else was that she had been ready when she needed to be, and that she was glad she had been. The Charleston Police Department closed the investigation into the shooting of Neil Falls as a justified homicide. The FBI investigation into his possible connection to other killings produced no confirmed charges. The silver Subaru was towed from outside Heather Saul's building and processed for evidence. The list of 6 women in his pocket was entered into evidence and used to contact and locate each of the women whose names appeared on it. The kill kit was catalogued and photographed. The machete, the axes, the knives, the shovel, the sledgehammer, the bleach, the plastic bags, the 4 pairs of handcuffs, the bulletproof vest, and the large plastic tote. Neil Falls had prepared for everything. He had not prepared for Heather Saul. The next case involves a man who spent years as the most trusted figure in his neighbourhood, handing out candy to the children he was secretly abusing and murdering, until one of the teenagers he had recruited to help him finally put a gun to his chest and pulled the trigger. Dean Corll and Elmer Wayne Henley Dean. Arnold Corll was born on December 24, 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He was quiet as a child, described by people who knew him as shy and a little socially awkward, but not violent, not obviously troubled. He grew up between Indiana and Texas, moving back and forth with his family as his parents' marriage repeatedly collapsed and reformed. His mother eventually remarried, and the family settled in Houston, Texas. By the time Dean Corll was a grown man, he was working at a candy company his family owned in the Houston Heights neighborhood, handing out free sweets to the local children, and everyone in the neighborhood thought he was one of the good ones. He was not. Between 1970 and 1973, Dean Corll committed devastating acts of violence against at least 28 teenage boys and young men in Houston and Pasadena, Texas, resulting in their deaths. He was aided by 2 teenage accomplices, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, whom he encountered in the same neighborhood where his victims lived. Using money, alcohol, and manipulation to bring them into his activities. Corll would pay the boys to lure their own friends and neighbours to his home. Once there, victims were restrained on a specially constructed wooden board, raped and tortured over periods that sometimes lasted days, and then killed by strangulation or by a single shot from a .22 caliber pistol. Their bodies were buried in a rented boat shed in woodland near Lake Sam Rayburn, on a beach in Jefferson County and along the Believer Peninsula. When the case finally came to light in August 1973, it was the worst serial murder case in American history at that time. 27 graves were uncovered in the days following Corll's death. The discovery stunned the country, and the only reason any of it was ever found was because on the morning of August 8th, 1973, 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley shot Dean Corll 6 times and killed him. Corll never faced trial. He never sat in a courtroom. He never gave a confession, never had to look at the families of the boys he had murdered. He died in his own home at the hands of the teenager he had spent 2 years grooming, controlling, and using to find victims. His murder was ruled justifiable homicide. What follows is the full account of how Dean Corll built his operation, how he controlled Henley and Brooks, what he did to the boys who were brought to him, and how it all ended on a morning in Pasadena when everything Corll had built came apart in 6 gunshots. The next section covers the background of Dean Corll, how he positioned himself in the Houston Heights neighborhood, and the early years of his operation before Elmer Wayne Henley became involved. The Houston Heights neighborhood in the early 1970s was a low-income area northwest of downtown Houston. The families who lived there were working class. Many of the teenagers who grew up there had limited supervision, came from single-parent homes, and spent a lot of time on the streets. It was the kind of neighborhood where a man who had candy, beer, and a car could build a reputation very quickly among the local kids as someone worth knowing. That is exactly what Dean Corll did. Corll Candy Company, the family business, had operated in the Heights for years. Dean had worked there since he was a teenager himself, and when his mother eventually handed more of the operation to him, he used the position to establish himself as a community fixture. He handed out free candy to neighborhood children at the factory. He was friendly, approachable, and generous in ways that stood out in a poor neighborhood. Adults who lived nearby described him as a good man. Parents trusted him. Children liked him because he gave them things. He was also a man who had been quietly struggling with his attraction to young males for his entire adult life. He had never acted on it in any documented way before 1970, though investigators would later note that he had resigned from 2 different positions that put him in contact with boys before his killing operation began. What changed in 1970 is not entirely clear. What is clear is that in 1970, he began killing. His first known accomplice was David Owen Brooks, a teenager from the Heights, who had known Corll for several years. Brooks had discovered accidentally that Corll was sexually interested in males, and used that knowledge to establish a financial arrangement. Corll paid Brooks for sexual activity, and eventually for something more. Brooks began bringing other boys to Corll, receiving payments of around $200 per victim, sometimes more. Brooks was a teenager who came from a difficult home, needed money, and had been drawn into Corll's world gradually over time, in a way that made it difficult to identify the exact moment he became complicit rather than simply exploited. The victims in the early years of the operation, from 1970 into 1971, were lured to Corll's various residences with offers of parties, rides, or work. Corll moved frequently during this period, living at a succession of addresses across Houston and Pasadena, and each address became a site of torture and murder. Once a victim was inside, Corll would drug them or overpower them by force and restrain them to a device he had built specifically for the purpose, a large wooden board with handcuffs and ropes attached at the corners so that a person could be spread-eagled and secured completely. What happened to the boys on that board was documented in the confessions of Henley and Brooks after Corll's death. The details were horrific. The abuse was prolonged. Boys were held for days in some cases before being killed. The bodies were disposed of methodically. Corll rented a boat storage shed in southwest Houston and used it as a primary burial site. He buried boys wrapped in plastic sheeting. He buried them in organized rows. He treated the disposal of their bodies with the same careful, practical attention he gave to everything else in his operation. 18 victims were eventually found in that shed alone. By 1971, Corll was escalating. The frequency of the killings was increasing. He needed more victims brought to him, and Brooks alone was not enough. He began targeting Elmer Wayne Henley. The next section covers how Corll recruited Elmer Wayne Henley, the dynamic between the two of them, and how Henley became central to the operation. Elmer Wayne Henley was 15 years old when he first came into contact with Dean Corll in 1971. He was from the Heights, the same neighbourhood where most of the victims would come from, and he had grown up knowing many of the boys who would later disappear. His family situation was difficult. His parents had separated, and he had taken on a degree of responsibility for his younger siblings that was unusual for a teenager. He had dropped out of high school and was working odd jobs. He was in short exactly the kind of young person Corll targeted. Someone who needed money, lacked stability, and would respond to an older man who paid attention to him and offered him things. Corll's approach to Henley was gradual. He presented himself as a friend and a mentor. He gave Henley money, he gave him alcohol, he let him bring friends over. He created a social environment around himself that made Henley feel included and valued. By the time Corll made clear what he actually wanted from Henley, the relationship had been established long enough, and the dependency was deep enough that walking away was not simple. Corll told Henley that he would pay him $200 for each boy Henley brought to him. Henley initially believed, or at least told himself, that the boys were being taken to participate in some kind of sexual arrangement with other men and then released. He understood relatively quickly that this was not true. The first time Henley witnessed what actually happened to a boy brought to Corll's home, he was confronted with a reality he had helped create and could not easily escape. What developed between Corll and Henley was not a partnership between equals. It was a relationship of control. Corll was 30 years older than Henley. He was physically larger. He had money. He had leverage. Henley later described feeling trapped in the situation, unable to leave because Corll had made threats about what would happen to Henley's younger brothers if Henley tried to walk away. In a 2010 interview, Henley said, "I could not leave anyway. If I did, I knew Dean would go after one of my little brothers, who he always liked a little too much." Whether Henley's account of coercion and control fully explains his participation is a question the courts eventually had to decide. What is not disputed is that between 1972 and 1973, Henley actively lured victims to Corll's home. Several of them were Henley's own friends. Several were boys he had grown up with, classmates and neighbours whose families he knew. He brought them to Corll under various pretexts: parties, drinking, the promise of a good time. Once they were inside Corll's home, they did not leave. Henley did not simply deliver victims passively. By the later stages of the operation, he participated in the murders. He admitted this in his confessions. 6 of the murders he was eventually tried for were ones in which he had directly participated in the killing. He was not a bystander who happened to be present. He was an active participant in some of the worst things that happened in that house. But he was also, by his own account and by the assessment of some investigators, a young person who had been systematically manipulated and controlled by an adult predator from the age of 15. The courts did not accept that as a complete defence. Henley was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to 6 consecutive 99-year prison terms. He remains incarcerated today. His compassionate release request in 2022 was denied. The dynamic between Corll and Henley in the summer of 1973 had been deteriorating for months. Henley described Corll as becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous, pushing him to bring boys more frequently, becoming more brutal in what he did to victims, and growing suspicious of both his accomplices. Henley said later that by July and August 1973 he felt certain that Corll was going to kill him. He had tried to enlist in the Navy that spring. His application was rejected because he was colourblind. There was no exit. Corll was escalating, and Henley was running out of options. The next section covers the night of August 7th into August 8th, 1973, the confrontation at Corll's Pasadena house, and the shooting that ended Dean Corll's life. On the evening of August 7th, 1973, Elmer Wayne Henley brought 2 people with him to Dean Corll's house at 2020 Lamar Drive in Pasadena, Texas. One was a 19-year-old named Timothy Curley. The other was a 15-year-old girl named Rhonda Williams. Bringing a girl was a problem. Corll had no interest in female victims. His targets were always male. Henley knew this. Bringing Rhonda Williams to Corll's house was either a miscalculation or a deliberate attempt to create a situation that might force a different outcome from the usual one. What followed that night suggests the latter may be closer to the truth. though Henley himself has given different accounts over the years. The three of them arrived at the house and spent the evening drinking and inhaling paint fumes, which was a common activity in that social circle at the time. At some point during the night, all three of them lost consciousness or fell into a heavy sleep. When they came around, they found themselves tied up. Curley and Rhonda Williams were restrained to Corll's torture board. Henley was also restrained separately. Corll was furious about the girl. He berated Henley for bringing her, told him she had no place there, and told Henley that he was going to kill all three of them, including Henley himself, because of the disruption. He was not calm, he was not measured. He was the version of Dean Corll that Henley had been watching emerge over the previous months, out of control, dangerous, and unpredictable in a way that the earlier Corll had not been. Henley pleaded with Corll. He told him he would participate in what was about to happen, that he would help, that bringing Rhonda Williams had been a mistake but that he could fix it. Corll, whether out of arrogance or some other calculation, released Henley from his restraints. This was the moment everything changed. Henley later told investigators that once he was free, the clarity of what he needed to do came to him immediately. He was not going to participate in killing his friends. He was not going to die in that house. He grabbed Corll's .22 caliber pistol. Corll's reaction, when he realized what was happening, was to challenge Henley. According to accounts drawn from Henley's statements and the investigation, Corll told him, "You would not kill me, Wayne." Henley shot him once, then again, then 4 more times, 6 shots total. Corll fell and did not get up. He was 33 years old. Henley then freed Timothy Curley and Rhonda Williams from the torture board. The 3 of them were alive. Dean Corll was dead on the floor. Henley called the Pasadena Police Department. He told them he had just shot a man. Police Detective David Mullican responded to the call. He later described the initial report as sounding like any other homicide. He had no idea what he was walking into. When investigators arrived at the house on Lamar Drive, Henley began talking. He told them Corll had tortured and murdered 6 teenagers at the house. Police immediately understood that this was not a routine shooting. Within hours, Henley was leading investigators to a boat storage shed in southwest Houston on Silver Bell Street. They began to dig. The first day they uncovered 8 bodies, the next day 9 more. From there, Henley led investigators to Woodland near Lake Sam Rayburn, where 4 more victims were found. He led them to a beach site where additional remains were recovered. David Brooks turned himself in the following day and added his own account. In total, investigators recovered 27 bodies in the days immediately following Corll's death. The number would eventually be confirmed at a minimum of 28, with some investigators believing the true total may be higher. The shooting of Dean Corll was ruled justifiable homicide on September 18, 1973. Prosecutors determined that Henley had acted in defense of himself and the 2 others who were restrained in the room. He was not charged with Corll's death. He was charged with 6 other murders. The next section covers the discovery of the victims, the identification process, and the scale of what investigators found in the aftermath of Corll's death. The boat storage shed on Silver Bell Street in southwest Houston was the primary burial site. Corll had rented it specifically for that purpose. Inside, investigators found 18 victims buried in organised rows, each wrapped in plastic sheeting, some tied at the hands and feet even in death. The shed was not immediately identifiable as a burial site from the outside. It looked like a storage unit. Inside, the plastic sheeting and the arrangement of the bodies made clear that someone had given significant thought to how the space would be used. The bodies at Lake Sam Rayburn were found in woodland dense enough that they might not have been discovered for years without Henley to point the way. The beach sites were similarly remote. Corll had chosen his disposal locations carefully. He had been burying victims for 3 years without a single body being discovered. The identification of the victims was a slow and painful process. Forensic pathologist Dr. Joseph Yakimchik, Houston's chief medical examiner, led the effort. Many of the bodies had been buried for months or years and were in advanced states of decomposition. Identifying them required comparing dental records, physical characteristics, and whatever clothing or personal items had been buried with them. Some victims were identified relatively quickly because their families had reported them missing and their physical descriptions matched. Others took years. In 2000, investigators working cold missing persons cases began working with forensic anthropologist Sharon Derrick at the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences to use advances in DNA analysis to identify victims who had remained nameless for nearly 30 years. Several victims who had been listed for decades as unidentified were given names during this effort. As recently as the early 2000s, new identifications were still being made, each one representing a family somewhere receiving an answer they had waited decades for. The total number of confirmed victims is listed at a minimum of 28. Some investigators believe the number is higher, pointing to Corll's movements before 1970 and the possibility that not all burial sites were found. The Houston mass murders, as they became known, were the worst serial killing case in American history at the time of their discovery. That designation would eventually be surpassed by other cases in later decades, but in 1973 nothing in documented American criminal history had produced a body count like this. The victims ranged in age from 13 to 20 years old. Almost all of them came from the Houston Heights neighborhood. Many of them were connected to each other: friends, classmates, neighbors, boys who had grown up on the same streets. Some of them had known David Brooks or Elmer Wayne Henley personally. Some had been recruited by those boys directly, promised a party or a night of drinking, and had no reason to suspect the invitation was anything other than what it appeared to be. The youngest confirmed victim was 13-year-old James Stanton Draymala, who was lured to Corll's last known residence in Pasadena in August 1973. He was out riding his bike looking for glass soda bottles to return for deposit money. He wanted enough cash to take his girlfriend to see the new James Bond film. He was held for several days, tortured and murdered. His body was found in the boat shed. His parents are among the last surviving parents of the victims of the Houston mass murders. The families of the victims had been failed for years before Corll's death. Dozens of boys had been reported missing from the Heights during the period of the murders, and in most cases police had classified them as runaways. The Heights was a poor neighborhood, and the boys who lived there were from families that did not always have the social connections or resources to push for sustained investigations. Parents who insisted their sons had not run away were frequently dismissed. The assumption that teenage boys from low-income families had simply chosen to leave was applied almost universally, and it allowed Corll to continue without scrutiny for 3 years. The grief and anger of the families was not a quiet thing. When the graves were uncovered and the scope of what Corll had done became public, many of the parents whose sons had been labelled runaways came forward to describe years of being ignored. Some of them had gone to the police repeatedly. Some had printed reward posters and distributed them through the neighbourhood. One of the boys who helped distribute those posters, going door to door and pinning them up to help find a missing friend, was Elmer Wayne Henley himself. He had participated in the search for boys he had already helped deliver to Dean Corll. The next section covers the trials of Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks, their sentences, and the current status of both men. Elmer Wayne Henley was 17 years old when he shot Dean Corll. He was tried as an adult. His first trial began on July 1, 1974 in San Antonio. Prosecutors chose to try him outside Houston due to the extraordinary level of publicity the case had generated in the city where the murders occurred. The trial lasted several weeks. Henley's defense attorneys did not call any witnesses on his behalf. They did not put Henley on the stand. They attacked the credibility of the state's witnesses and the admissibility of Henley's written confession, arguing it had been obtained without Henley being properly informed of his legal rights. Judge Preston Dial ruled the confession admissible. The prosecution called 24 witnesses and introduced 82 pieces of evidence, including Corll's torture board. Witnesses included Timothy Curley and Rhonda Williams, both of whom testified to the events of August 7th and 8th, 1973. The jury convicted Henley on 6 counts of murder and sentenced him to 6 consecutive 99-year prison terms. The sentences were later appealed. A retrial was ordered. The retrial, held in Corpus Christi in June 1979, produced the same result. 6 convictions, 6 sentences of 99 years, this time to run concurrently rather than consecutively. Henley has been denied parole multiple times over the decades. He has applied repeatedly. Each time, the families of the victims have mobilized to oppose his release, appearing before parole boards, writing letters, and making public statements. The parents of James Stanton Draymala, the youngest confirmed victim, have been among the most consistent voices against Henley's release. His sister, speaking publicly about a compassionate release request Henley filed in 2022, said that Henley did not deserve any compassion because her brother had been given none. The compassionate release request was denied. In 2010, Henley gave an interview in which he described the period leading up to Corll's death. He said he felt trapped. that leaving was not an option because of the threat to his brothers, and that by the summer of 1973, he believed Corll was going to kill him. He described the escalation of the previous months as being like a bloodlust in Corll, a phrase that Henley's attorneys have used in subsequent parole hearings to argue that he had been operating under extreme duress and psychological control throughout his participation in the murders. The debate about Henley's culpability has not been resolved in any clean way. He was a teenager recruited by a predatory adult who used money, manipulation, and threats to bring him into a criminal operation. He was also a person who, once recruited, actively lured his own friends and neighbours to their deaths. He participated directly in at least 6 murders. The courts have consistently held that his youth and the circumstances of his recruitment do not eliminate his responsibility for what he did. His most recent parole eligibility review began in mid-2025. A decision is expected later that year. The families of the victims are preparing to oppose it again. David Brooks was arrested on August 9, 1973, the day after Corll's death. He was 18 years old at the time of his arrest. He had been involved with Corll's operation since earlier than Henley, having first begun helping lure victims while he was still a young teenager. He was charged with 4 counts of murder, tried separately from Henley, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. He died in 2020 of complications related to COVID-19, still incarcerated. Dean Corll himself was never charged with anything. His death came before any investigation, before any arrest, before any family received any kind of official acknowledgement that their missing son had been murdered rather than having chosen to disappear. The families of 28 confirmed victims received no trial, no sentencing, no courtroom moment of any kind involving the man who killed their sons. They received only excavations and body bags and the long, grinding process of identifying remains. The next section covers the legacy of the Houston mass murders, the impact on the community, and the ongoing effort to identify victims and bring closure to families. The Houston mass murders changed the way America understood serial killing. In 1973, the term serial killer did not yet exist in popular usage. The FBI's behavioral science unit, which would later pioneer criminal profiling, was in its infancy. There was no centralized database for missing persons, no national registry that would have flagged the disappearance of dozens of teenage boys from the same neighborhood over 3 years as a potential pattern. Police departments investigating missing persons cases in one part of a city had no systematic way of connecting those cases to other disappearances in nearby areas. The case exposed the absence of those systems in the starkest possible way. 28 boys had been taken from a single neighborhood over 3 years. Their families had reported them missing repeatedly. The prevailing assumption had been that teenage boys from poor families ran away. The Houston Police Department faced significant criticism in the aftermath of the case for having failed to connect the missing persons reports, for having categorized victims as runaways without adequate investigation, and for having missed opportunities to identify Corll as a suspect. One of the starkest examples of that failure involved Elmer Wayne Henley himself. In early 1973, the parents of one missing boy had gone to police and named Henley as someone who had possibly been involved in their son's disappearance. The lead was not meaningfully pursued. The case also demonstrated, in a way that could not be dismissed, that serial killers could operate in plain sight. Corll had been a visible, friendly presence in the neighborhood. He gave candy to children. He was known to parents as someone who looked out for the local kids. The image of the community predator operating behind a mask of generosity and goodwill became, in the years after the Houston mass murders, a fixture of public understanding of how these crimes work. The identification of the victims continued for decades after the initial excavations. Sharon Derrick's forensic work at the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences, which began in the late 1990s and continued into the 2010s, used DNA analysis to give names back to victims who had been listed as unidentified for nearly 30 years. Families received notifications that the remains of a son, a brother, a nephew had been found and identified long after they had given up expecting any answer at all. In 2023, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released a new forensic facial reconstruction of one victim from 1973 who remains unidentified. The reconstruction was created in the hope that someone who knew the Houston Heights neighborhood in the early 1970s might recognize the face. As of the writing of this script, the individual has not been identified. He is referred to in case files as John Doe 1973. He is the only confirmed victim of the Houston mass murders who has not been given a name. The boat shed on Silver Bell Street, where 18 victims were buried, no longer exists. The address has changed over the decades. There is no marker there. The house on Lamar Drive in Pasadena, where Dean Corll was shot, also no longer exists in its original form. The neighborhood has changed. The families of the victims, the ones who are still alive, continue to attend parole hearings for Elmer Wayne Henley. Some of them have been doing so for more than 30 years. The name Dean Corll is known primarily to people who follow true crime history in depth. He did not receive the sustained national attention given to killers who were caught alive and tried in public. He died before anyone outside the Heights neighborhood knew who he was. His face appears in a single widely circulated photograph, a black and white image of a man who looks entirely ordinary, the kind of face you would not notice on a bus or in a grocery store. There is nothing in the photograph that explains what he did. Elmer Wayne Henley, now in his late 60s, has spent more than 50 years in prison. In the 2022 compassionate release request, he cited health issues as the basis for the petition. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice declined to specify the nature of those health issues. The denial was communicated to the families of the victims through notification letters. The parents of James Drymala, the youngest victim, were among those who received one. The last confirmed thing Dean Corll said, before Henley picked up the gun, was that Henley would not shoot him. He was wrong about that, and whatever calculation led him to believe it was safe to release Henley from his restraints was the last mistake he made. The 6 shots Henley fired ended the Houston mass murders. They also, within hours, began the process of recovering the victims that Corll had spent 3 years burying in the dark. The case remains one of the most significant in American criminal history, not because of how it ended, but because of how long it continued before it did. The next case involves a father who sat at a payphone in an airport in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, waiting for the man who had raped his 11-year-old son to be walked off a plane in handcuffs, and what happened in the next 4 seconds was caught on live television. Jeff Doucet and Gary Plauché. Jeff Doucet was 25 years old on the night of March 16, 1984, when he was walked through the Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport in handcuffs by 2 East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's deputies. He had just been flown back from California to face a charge of aggravated kidnapping. On the flight back, he had also acknowledged inappropriate contact with Jody Plauché, the 11-year-old boy he had taken from Baton Rouge to Anaheim, and with other children as well. The deputies escorting him, Mike Barnett and Bud Connor, were walking him through the main corridor of the terminal. A WBRZ TV news crew was filming the arrival. The camera was rolling. Gary Plauché was standing at a bank of payphones along the corridor wall. He was wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. He had a revolver concealed on his person. He was holding a phone receiver to his ear, talking to his best friend. He had positioned himself so that his back was to the corridor. As Doucet was walked past him by the deputies, Gary Plauché turned around, stepped forward, and fired 1 shot into the right side of Doucet's head from approximately 3 feet away. Then he lowered the gun, turned back to the phones, and hung up the receiver. The camera captured every second of it. Doucet fell immediately. He was taken to a hospital where he died the following day, March 17, 1984, from the gunshot wound. He was 25 years old. Gary Plauché was handcuffed on the spot by the deputies who had been escorting Doucet. As they restrained him, one of them asked, "Gary, why? Why, Gary?" Gary Plauché's answer was, "If somebody did it to your kid, you would do it too." The footage of the shooting aired on national television. It became one of the most widely seen pieces of news video from that decade. It showed, in approximately 4 seconds, a father who had decided that the legal system was not sufficient punishment for the man who had raped his son, and who had acted on that decision in public, on camera, in front of law enforcement. The legal, moral, and emotional questions raised by those 4 seconds occupied the country for months. They have never entirely gone away. What follows is the full account of how Jeff Doucet came to be walking through that airport, what he had done to Jody Plauché, and what happened to Gary Plauché after he put the gun away. The next section covers who Jeff Doucet was, how he came into contact with the Plauché family, and the process by which he groomed and abused Jody Plauché over more than a year before the kidnapping. Jeff Doucet was born on February 3, 1959, in Louisiana. He was a karate instructor, working in the Baton Rouge area teaching martial arts classes to children and teenagers. He was young, energetic and good with kids in the way that predators who target children often are. He paid attention to them. He made them feel special. He positioned himself as a cool older figure rather than a formal adult authority. Parents who interacted with him described him as likable and trustworthy. He presented himself as someone who cared about the development of the children he taught. Jody Plauché was born on April the 27th, 1972. In the fall of 1982, when he was around 10 years old, he began taking karate lessons. He started with a different instructor, but within a few months had transferred to Jeff Doucette's classes. By Jody's account in later interviews, the grooming process began almost immediately after he started training with Doucet. Doucette began paying particular attention to him, spending extra time with him after class, positioning himself as a mentor and friend rather than just a teacher. He became close to the Plauché family over time, building a bond of trust with them. His behaviour toward the family was calculated, though Jody was too young to recognise this at the time. By early 1983, approximately a year before the abduction, there were incidents involving Jody that should not have occurred. This continued for some time before he made the choice to remove Jody from his home and take him far away. In interviews years later, Jody explained that he stayed silent because he was afraid and confused. He did not fully understand what was happening between them. Part of him sensed it was not right, but he also cared for this person who had become such a significant presence in his life, and that exposing what was happening would destroy something he had been made to believe he valued. This is the mechanism of grooming. The abuser creates a distorted emotional bond with the child that makes disclosure feel like loss rather than protection. Gary Plauché later said that he had noticed nothing. Doucet had been so effective in his manipulation of the entire family that Gary had no suspicion of what was happening to his son. He described feeling afterward an enormous guilt about having trusted Doucet, about having welcomed him into the family and allowed him to spend time alone with Jody. That guilt was part of what drove what happened at the airport. According to the people closest to him, Gary Plauché spent the weeks after Jody's recovery torturing himself with the question of how he had not seen it. On February 19th, 1984, a Sunday, Jeff Doucet took Jody Plauché from Baton Rouge. He drove him first to a relative's house in Port Arthur, Texas, and then put him on a bus to Los Angeles. The two of them traveled to Anaheim, California, where they checked into a motel. The kidnapping triggered a statewide and then national missing persons alert. Jody was gone. For 10 days, his family did not know where he was. The next section covers the 10 days of Jody's disappearance, how he was found, the arrest of Jeff Doucet in California, and the moment Gary Plauché learned what had been done to his son. Jody Plauché had been missing for 10 days when his mother, June, received a collect phone call. The caller was Jody. He told her he was safe and that he was in California. The FBI had been monitoring the Plauché family's phone line since the disappearance, and the call was being recorded. After Jody spoke briefly with his mother, Doucet took the phone. He told June that she should bring the other children to California, suggesting some kind of arrangement. June kept him talking, following the guidance she had been given by investigators. The call was traced to a motel in Anaheim. California police moved quickly. They raided the motel on February 29, 1984. Jody was found and immediately taken into protective custody. He was safe, physically unharmed in the immediate sense, though what Doucet had continued to do to him in that motel room over the 10 days of the disappearance would later be documented in a rape kit examination that confirmed the sexual abuse. Jeff Doucet was arrested at the scene without incident. He was 25 years old, and he had just committed serious crimes against an 11-year-old child. Jody was flown back to his family in Louisiana on March 1, 1984. His parents were waiting for him. The reunion was described by those present as both joyful and devastating, as reunions of this kind tend to be. The child was back, but the knowledge of what had happened to him came with him. The news of what Doucet had done reached Gary Plauché through Mike Barnett, a former East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's Major who had been involved in the search for Jody and who knew the Plauché family personally. Barnett was the one who sat down with Gary and told him the full extent of what Jeff Doucet had done to his son, not just in California, but going back more than a year. He told Gary about the manipulation. He told Gary about the inappropriate conduct that had begun when Jody was around 10 years old. He told him that the man they had all trusted, the karate instructor Gary had personally allowed into his family's life, had been systematically raping his child. According to Barnett, Gary's reaction was one he had seen from other parents in similar situations: horror, grief, and then a very specific kind of rage. Gary told Barnett directly, "I will kill that son of a bitch." Barnett did not take the statement as a credible threat at that moment. People in Gary's position said things like that. The rage was expected. The actual act of following through was something else. Barnett did not alert law enforcement. He did not arrange for additional security around Doucet when the extradition was being organised. He told investigators later that he had not believed Gary would actually do it. In the days that followed, Gary Plauché did not go home and calm down. He went to a local bar called the Cotton Club and sat there, drinking, asking anyone who came in whether they knew when Doucet would be brought back to Baton Rouge for trial. He was not hiding his intentions from people who knew him. He was openly asking about the timeline of Doucet's return. No one who heard him took action to stop what was clearly being contemplated. On March 16th, 1984, while Gary Plauché was at the Cotton Club, he ran into someone he knew from his years working at WBRZ, the local television station. That person told him that Jeff Doucet would be flown back to Baton Rouge that evening on American Airlines Flight 595, arriving at the Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport at around 9:30 p.m. Gary Plauché went home, retrieved his .38 caliber revolver, loaded it with hollow point bullets, put it in his right boot and drove to the airport. The next section covers the night of March 16, 1984, the shooting at the airport and the immediate aftermath. Gary Plauché arrived at the airport before the flight landed. He positioned himself at a bank of payphones in the main corridor, the area through which arriving passengers and anyone being escorted from the gate would have to pass. He put on his baseball cap and his sunglasses. He picked up a phone receiver and called his best friend Jimmy. He told Jimmy what he was about to do. According to Jimmy's account given to journalists in subsequent years, Gary said, "Here he comes. You're about to hear a shot." The WBRZ TV news crew was at the airport to film the arrival of Jeff Doucet as part of their coverage of the kidnapping case. They had set up their camera to capture the moment. They did not know Gary Plauché was there. Deputies Mike Barnett and Bud Connor walked Jeff Doucet off the plane and through the terminal. Doucet was in handcuffs. He was wearing civilian clothes. He had confessed on the flight back to having sexually abused Jody Plauché and to having abused other children as well. Barnett, who knew Gary personally, had not warned the security detail that Gary had explicitly threatened to kill Doucet. Whether this was a genuine failure to assess the threat or something more complicated has never been fully resolved. As Barnett and Connor walked Doucet through the corridor, they passed the bank of payphones where Gary was standing with his back to them. Gary had positioned himself so that he would hear them approaching and could time his movement. When Doucet came level with him, Gary turned around. He stepped forward. He pressed the gun against the right side of Jeff Doucet's head at approximately 3 feet distance and fired one shot. The hollow point bullet entered Doucet's right ear. He dropped immediately. The camera caught all of it. The footage shows Gary turning from the phones, raising the gun, the shot, Doucet collapsing, and the deputies immediately grabbing Gary and pinning him against the phone bank. The whole sequence takes less than 5 seconds. Gary lowered the gun and turned back to the phones after firing. He placed the receiver down deliberately. He did not attempt to flee. He did not resist when the deputies restrained him. As they held him against the wall, one of them repeated the question, "Gary, why? Gary, why?" He said, "If somebody did it to your kid, you would do it too." He was taken into custody on the spot. Jeff Doucet was transported to a hospital. He never regained consciousness. He died the following morning, March 17, 1984, from the gunshot wound to his head. At home that evening, June Plauché had just returned from an outing with the children when she turned on the news. The anchor said that an unidentified man had shot Jeff Doucet at the airport. June's knees gave out. She fell backward onto the carpet. She knew immediately who the unidentified man was. When she saw Gary in lockup later that night, the first thing she said to him was, "You're going to hell for this. You know that, right?" Gary's answer was not recorded. Jody Plauché, who was 11 years old and at the family camp on False River when the shooting happened, did not find out about it until the next morning. His grandparents came to get him and drove him back to Baton Rouge. He could tell from the urgency of the trip that something had happened. When he found out that his father had shot Jeff Doucet, his immediate reaction was not relief or gratitude. He was upset. He had not wanted Doucet dead. Despite everything Doucet had done to him, Jody had a complicated emotional response that took years to fully work through. He described this in detail in his 2019 book and in numerous public interviews. He eventually came to understand his father's action and to make peace with it, but the immediate response was anger. The next section covers the legal proceedings against Gary Plauché, the charge he faced, the sentence he received, and the public reaction to the case. Gary Plauché was initially charged with second-degree murder. The charge reflected the legal reality of what he had done. He had shot a man who was in police custody, not in any immediate act of violence, and second-degree murder was the appropriate charge under Louisiana law for an intentional killing that did not meet the specific criteria of first-degree murder. The case became one of the most publicly discussed legal situations in the country in 1984. The footage of the shooting had already been broadcast nationally. Public opinion in Baton Rouge and across much of the United States was strongly sympathetic to Gary Plauché. People who knew him described him to journalists as a good man, a devoted father, someone who had been pushed beyond the limit of what any parent could reasonably be expected to endure. A local riverboat captain named Murray Curry told journalists, "He is a father who did it out of love for his child and for his pride." A defense fund was set up to help Gary pay his $100,000 bail and keep his family financially stable during the legal process. Donations came in from strangers. The prosecutor's office faced a genuinely difficult situation. The evidence of what Gary Plauché had done was entirely unambiguous. He had shot Jeff Doucet on camera in front of multiple law enforcement officers. There was no question of who had fired the gun or why. The legal question was what to do about it in a community where the overwhelming sentiment was that Gary had done something most people understood, even if they could not quite endorse it. Gary's defense attorney, Louis Unglesby, built the case around the psychological impact of what Gary had learned about the abuse of his son. Psychological reports examined Gary's mental state in the period between learning about the extent of the abuse and the night of the shooting. The reports described a man who had been in a state of extreme psychological distress, operating under an emotional burden that the defense argued had significantly impaired his capacity for rational decision-making. The defense presented Gary not as a calculating vigilante, but as a father who had been psychologically shattered by the discovery of what had been done to his child and who had acted in a state that amounted to a temporary psychological crisis. The plea negotiations ultimately produced an arrangement under which Gary pleaded no contest to a charge of manslaughter. Manslaughter, rather than second-degree murder, reflected an acknowledgement by the prosecution that the circumstances surrounding the killing distinguished it from a premeditated, calculated homicide in the conventional sense, even though Gary had clearly planned what he did. On the day of sentencing, the judge reviewed the psychological evaluations, the facts of the case, and Gary's character as presented by witnesses who testified to his standing in the community and his role as a father. The judge determined that Gary Plauché presented no danger to the community. He sentenced Gary to 7 years in prison, suspended the sentence entirely, and placed Gary on 5 years of probation with 300 hours of community service. Gary Plauché did not serve a single day in prison beyond the time he had spent in custody immediately following the shooting. The community service was completed at Gary's local church, where he spent much of his time cutting the grass. The reaction to the sentence was largely positive in Baton Rouge. Nationally, the response was more divided. Legal scholars noted the obvious tension. The justice system had effectively declined to punish a man who had committed a deliberate, premeditated killing in front of law enforcement officers and a television camera. The argument that the circumstances made the killing understandable was widely accepted by the public, but it raised serious questions about where that principle stopped. Defense attorneys and legal commentators pointed out that the same logic, applied broadly, would make it very difficult to enforce the law consistently in cases involving emotional provocation. Advocates for child victims and survivors of sexual abuse had a more complicated relationship with the outcome. Many expressed understanding of Gary's actions. Some expressed concern that the glorification of vigilante violence could discourage children from coming forward about abuse, out of fear that disclosure would lead to someone being killed, which could make the consequences of telling even harder for a child to process. This concern was not hypothetical. Jody Plauché himself addressed it in his later advocacy work. noting that he had been afraid to tell his father about the abuse precisely because he feared something violent would happen. The next section covers the aftermath of the case, the long-term impact on Jodie Plauché, Gary Plauché's later life, and what the case meant for public understanding of child sexual abuse. Gary Plauché completed his probation and his community service by 1989. He returned to a version of ordinary life. He was not the same man he had been before February 1984, and the people who knew him well said he never recovered the ease and lightness that had characterized him before he learned what had been done to Jodie. He suffered a series of strokes beginning around 2011 that left him significantly diminished. He spent his final years in a nursing home in Baton Rouge. In the years before his health declined, Gary gave occasional interviews. In one of them, conducted when he was 67 years old, he was asked directly whether he regretted shooting Jeff Doucette. His answer was that he did not regret it, and that he would do it again. He did not say this with bravado. People who were present described him as measured, quiet, and certain. It was not a performance, it was a statement of fact from a man who had had decades to consider the question and had arrived at the same answer every time. Gary Plauché died on October 20th, 2014, at the age of 68, from complications of the strokes he had suffered. He died in a nursing home in Baton Rouge. Jodie Plauché's path after the events of 1984 was long and complicated. He was 11 years old when his father shot the man who had abused him, and the years that followed required him to process not just the abuse itself, but the very public nature of everything that happened afterward. His case had been covered nationally. His name was known. The footage of his father shooting Doucette was something he knew existed, and that other people had seen. He attended Louisiana State University and served on the executive board of Men Against Violence. After graduation, he worked at the Victim Services Center of Montgomery County as a sexual assault counselor. He committed himself to advocacy work around child sexual abuse prevention, educating parents about the tactics predators use to groom children and gain access to families. He became particularly focused on helping parents understand how to talk to their children about abuse in a way that does not make disclosure feel dangerous. In August 2019, he published his book titled Why, Gary, Why? The Jodie Plauché Story. In it, he described the full arc of his experience, from the beginning of the grooming by Doucette, through the kidnapping, through his father's shooting of Doucette, and through the long process of understanding and recovery that followed. He was candid about the fact that his initial reaction to his father's action was anger. He was candid about the complexity of his feelings toward Doucette, and about how long it took him to disentangle the distorted emotional bond that Doucette had created in him from what was actually real. He also addressed directly the concern raised by advocates, that glorifying his father's act of violence could make things harder for children to come forward about abuse. He said in interviews and in the book that he understood that concern and took it seriously. He said that he himself had been afraid to tell his father about the abuse because he knew his father would react in an extreme way. He said that this fear was part of what had allowed the abuse to continue for as long as it did. His advocacy work has focused heavily on encouraging parents to create environments where children feel safe disclosing abuse, without fearing that disclosure will set off an uncontrollable chain of events. In a 2024 interview, Jodie Plauché described his father as the greatest dad of all time. By that point, he had had 40 years to arrive at a place where he could hold both things at once. That his father had done something legally and ethically complicated, and that his father had done it out of a love for him that was total and unquestioning. The footage of the shooting at the Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport has never disappeared. It resurfaced regularly in the decades after 1984, shared on television programs about vigilante justice, about crime, about parental love, about the limits of the law. When it became possible to share video online, the footage found a new and much larger audience. It has been viewed millions of times. The 4 seconds of footage that show Gary Plauché turning from the phone bank and firing that single shot have been analysed, debated and discussed in law school classrooms, in ethics seminars, in true crime forums, and in countless private conversations between people who watched it and had to decide what they thought about what they saw. The legal community has never reached a consensus. The case is cited regularly as an example of the tension between law and justice, the conflict between legal boundaries and community expectations when the system's response feels inadequate. Jeff Doucette had been arrested and was awaiting trial. The legal proceedings were following their expected course. Gary Plauché determined this was not enough. The judge who handled Gary's case later indicated that the circumstances called for some degree of consideration. Whether this reflected true justice or simply compassion remains debatable. The core facts are clear. For more than a year, Jeff Doucette engaged in wrongful behaviour involving a child. He then removed that child from his home, and the situation continued for 10 days across multiple locations. He was apprehended and brought back to Louisiana, and walked through an airport in handcuffs. He never saw the inside of a courtroom. He died in a hospital in Baton Rouge on the morning of March 17, 1984, from a single hollow-point bullet fired by the boy's father. Gary Plauché went home. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves a woman in Dansville, Michigan, who spent 13 years being beaten, raped, and controlled by the man she had married at 16, until the night he forced her to burn her own schoolbooks, and she decided, while he lay in a drunken sleep, that she was done surviving him. Francine Hughes and Mickey Hughes. Francine Moran was born on August 17, 1947 in Stockbridge, Michigan. She grew up in a household where her father was an abusive alcoholic, and her mother taught her, by word and by example, that a wife's job was to do what was best for her husband. She left high school without graduating and married James Berlin Hughes, known to everyone as Mickey, when she was 16 years old. The marriage began on their honeymoon, when Mickey accused her of dressing too revealingly and tore her clothing off her body. That was 1963. The next time anything changed in a significant way was March 9th, 1977, when Mickey Hughes died in a fire in the bedroom of their home in Dansville, Michigan, with Francine's gasoline poured around his bed. In between those two dates, 13 years passed. 13 years of beatings, rape, starvation, humiliation, and a justice system that repeatedly declined to intervene in what it classified as a private family matter. Francine Hughes called police multiple times during those years. She went to court. She went to social services. She went to Mickey's own family. Nobody stopped him. Nobody removed him. Nobody did anything that actually changed what was happening inside that house. On the night of March 9th, 1977, after Mickey had beaten her, forced her to burn her own schoolbooks, and raped her, and after he had finally fallen into a drunken sleep, Francine Hughes walked to the garage, filled a container with gasoline, carried it back to the bedroom, poured it around the bed where Mickey was sleeping, took her 4 children to the car and lit a match. Then she drove to the Ingham County Sheriff's Department and turned herself in. A jury found her not guilty by reason of temporary insanity on November 3rd, 1977. The verdict made national news. It became the basis for a book, and then for a 1984 NBC television movie called The Burning Bed, starring Farrah Fawcett, that was watched by an estimated 40 million people on the night it aired. Francine Hughes did not seek fame from any of it. She remarried, became a nurse, and spent the rest of her life as quietly as she could. She died on March 22, 2017, at the age of 69 in Layton, Alabama, from complications of pneumonia. What follows is the account of the marriage, the abuse, the night of the fire, and what the case produced in terms of legal and social change. The next section covers the early years of the marriage between Francine and Mickey Hughes, the onset of the abuse, and the patterns that defined the next decade of Francine's life. Mickey Hughes was not, by the accounts of people who knew him in the early years, an obviously dangerous person. He was young. He had a car, which in the world Francine grew up in counted for something. He was charming in the way that some people are charming before they feel secure enough to stop. Francine described being attracted to him because he seemed sophisticated to her. She was 16. He was not much older. The abuse began immediately. After the incident on their honeymoon, Mickey established early in the marriage that he was in charge and that his authority over Francine was physical as well as social. He beat her regularly. He beat her for things she did, for things she did not do, for things that had nothing to do with her at all. He destroyed furniture. He screamed at her in front of the children. He threatened her constantly. He told her repeatedly that if she tried to leave, things would get worse. They divorced in 1971. This detail is important because what happened after the divorce is part of what made Francine's situation so difficult to escape. Mickey was injured in a serious car accident. The accident left him temporarily unable to care for himself. Francine, operating from a combination of guilt, financial necessity, and a belief instilled in her from childhood that a wife cared for her husband, agreed to take Mickey in and care for him during his recovery. He moved back into her home. He never left. After he recovered from the accident, the abuse resumed and escalated. Mickey's alcoholism worsened. He was violent more frequently and more severely. He killed the family's pets in front of the children. He strangled the kitten their daughter had been given as a gift. He ripped telephones out of walls. He smashed furniture. He raped Francine repeatedly. He controlled what she ate, what she wore, and whether she was permitted to leave the house. The police came to the house multiple times over the years following the divorce. Each time, unless they had personally witnessed an assault, they declined to arrest Mickey. This was standard practice in the 1970s. Domestic violence was classified legally and socially as a private family matter. The police role was to calm the situation down and leave, not to make arrests based on a wife's account of what her husband had done. Francine later described the experience of calling police and watching them talk to Mickey for a few minutes, and then drive away as one of the most demoralizing things she endured. She knew they were not coming back. Mickey knew it too. His behavior after police left was often worse than before they arrived. She reached out to Mickey's own family. They were not helpful. She reached out to social services. The response was minimal. She was told repeatedly in various ways that the situation was her responsibility to manage. She was given tranquilizers by a doctor. She was offered assertiveness training. Nobody offered her a way out that actually worked, because the system in the 1970s did not have a mechanism for removing a man from a home he had decided to stay in, regardless of what he was doing to the people inside it. Francine tried to leave on multiple occasions. Each time, Mickey found her and forced her to come back. He made clear that leaving was not something she was permitted to do. He had no intention of allowing her to build a life without him in it. The next section covers the day of March 9, 1977, the specific events that led to the fire, and what Francine did after Mickey fell asleep. In 1976, Francine enrolled in a secretarial course at a local business school. It was the first deliberate step she had taken toward building any kind of financial independence. She needed her mother's help to do it, because Mickey controlled the money and would not have agreed to pay for it. The secretarial course represented something concrete, a skill that might eventually allow her to support herself and her children without him. Mickey hated it. He told her repeatedly to quit. He undermined it in every way he could. He made the logistics of attending as difficult as possible. He demanded she be home at specific times, knowing the schedule of the course made that difficult. He raged about it when she came home. On March 9th, 1977, Francine came home from class in the afternoon. She had given a classmate a ride home, which had made her slightly late. Mickey was drunk and furious. He refused to allow her to cook dinner for the children. He knocked food to the floor and then forced her face down into the mess and made her clean it up with her hands. He dumped a trash can on the floor and made her clean that up too. He told her she was quitting the secretarial course. When she did not agree quickly enough, he forced her to take her textbooks outside and burn them. She burned them. After the books were burned, he forced her to cook his dinner. After dinner, he raped her. Then he fell asleep in the bedroom. The police had been called at some point during the day's violence. They came. They saw that Mickey had not assaulted Francine in their direct presence. They left. Before they drove away, Mickey told Francine that it was all over for her, now that she'd called the authorities for help. The police officers heard him say this. They left anyway. After they left, Mickey resumed beating her. Then he ate. Then he raped her. Then he slept. Francine's youngest child, Dana, had not yet come home. She was waiting for him. At some point while she waited, she made her decision. She described it later in terms that were not dramatic. She said she had been thinking about everything that had happened, all of it, not just that day but all the years, and something clarified. She said she stood still for a moment, and a voice in her head told her to do it. She went to the garage and found a can of gasoline. She carried it to the bedroom where Mickey was sleeping. She poured it around the bed. She went back through the house, gathering her children and getting them into the car. Then she returned, lit the gasoline on fire, walked back to the car and drove away. The house burned. Mickey Hughes died in the fire. Francine drove to the Ingham County Sheriff's Department in the nearby town. She walked in and told them what she'd done. She said, "I did it. I set the house on fire with my husband sleeping in bed. She was hysterical by the accounts of the officers who received her. She was not attempting to flee or conceal anything. She had killed Mickey Hughes, and she was telling the police immediately and directly. She was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The next section covers the trial of Francine Hughes, the defense her attorney used, the verdict, and what the outcome meant legally. Francine's defense attorney was Arian Greydanis, a public defender. He had to decide how to approach a case in which his client had unambiguously killed her husband and was openly admitting to having done so. A conventional self-defense argument had significant problems. Mickey had been asleep when Francine lit the fire. He was not attacking her at the moment of his death. Under the legal standards of the time, self-defense required an immediate and present threat, and a man asleep in his bed did not meet that standard. Greydanis made the decision to pursue a defense of temporary insanity. He argued that the years of sustained abuse had pushed Francine into a psychological state in which she was no longer capable of distinguishing right from wrong at the moment she set the fire. He presented testimony about the nature and duration of the abuse, about the repeated failures of the legal system to protect her, and about the psychological condition that results from long-term domestic violence. The trial opened in October 1977. Francine testified about the abuse in detail. She described specific incidents, specific injuries, the specific events of March 9th. Both the prosecution and the defense agreed that her account was sympathetic. The disagreement was about whether sympathy translated into a legal defense. The jury was made up of 10 women and 2 men. They deliberated and returned a verdict of not guilty by reason of temporary insanity on November 3rd, 1977. Francine Hughes was acquitted. She walked out of the courthouse with her children. The verdict was immediately controversial. Critics argued that it effectively created a legal framework in which a history of abuse could justify killing an abuser under almost any circumstances, and that the requirement of an immediate threat had been circumvented. Supporters argued that the legal system had repeatedly failed Francine, and that the verdict reflected a recognition of how thoroughly that system had let her down. Greydanis himself said afterward that he believed a straight self-defense argument would not have worked, and that the temporary insanity defense had been the only viable path. He said the jury had clearly been moved by what Francine had described, and that the 10 women on the jury had responded to her account in a way that 12 men might not have. The phrase burning bed syndrome entered the legal and academic vocabulary after the case. It described the situation of abuse survivors who killed their abusers not during an active assault, but during a period of relative calm, and the legal challenges that arose from the mismatch between their circumstances and the traditional requirements of self-defense law. California became the first state to pass meaningful legal reform, allowing evidence of sustained abuse to be considered in these cases. Other states followed over the following decades. The Violence Against Women Act, passed by Congress in 1994, created a national domestic violence hotline, mandated that protection orders be enforceable across state lines, and provided federal funding for domestic violence training for law enforcement. The trail of legal reform that connects to Francine Hughes's case, and others like it, runs directly into that legislation. The Burning Bed, the NBC television movie that aired on October 8, 1984, with Farrah Fawcett playing Francine, was watched by approximately 40 million people. The night it aired, domestic violence hotlines across the country were flooded with calls. Women who had been in situations similar to Francine's, who had never told anyone, called in numbers that the hotlines were not equipped to handle. The film had reached people in ways that legal reform and advocacy work had not. Several men who had been abusing their partners were also reported to have turned themselves into police in the days following the broadcast, telling authorities they had watched the film and were afraid of what their partners might do. The next section covers Francine's life after the trial, the lasting impact of the case, and what the burning of Mickey Hughes's bed ultimately produced beyond Francine herself. After her acquittal, Francine Hughes tried to live as quietly as possible. She had not sought to become a symbol or a public figure. She had killed a man who had been destroying her for 13 years, and then she'd gone to the police station and told them what she had done. She had not planned a campaign. She had not written a manifesto. She had simply reached a point at which she was no longer able to continue living the way she had been living, and she had acted. In 1980, she married Robert Wilson, a country musician. She took his last name and became Francine Wilson. She trained as a licensed practical nurse and worked in nursing homes for years. She sat with elderly patients and taught nursing classes. She did not, for most of the rest of her life, identify herself publicly as the woman from the burning bed. Only her closest friends and family knew. Her granddaughter Molly, who lived with her and was legally adopted by her, said after her death that Francine had never felt proud of what had happened, had never felt justified or free. She felt ashamed and haunted by it. Those were Molly's words about her grandmother's private feelings, and they complicate the public image of the case considerably. The public image of Francine Hughes was that of a woman who had fought back, who had survived, who had inspired legal reform and saved other women's lives. The private reality, by the account of the people who knew her best, was a woman who spent the rest of her life carrying the weight of having killed someone, regardless of what he had done to her. She never said publicly that she was glad Mickey was dead. She never performed triumph. She gave occasional interviews over the years, always measured, always careful, always describing events rather than celebrating them. Mickey Hughes's family experienced the case differently. His sister, who gave an interview decades later, described growing up, knowing what had happened, and trying to process it as a family member of someone who had been killed. She acknowledged the abuse that Francine had suffered. She also described what it was like to lose a brother, regardless of who he had been or what he had done. The ripple effects of what happened in that house in Dansville went far beyond Francine and Mickey themselves. Mickey's brother also died young, in circumstances the family described as a possible suicide. The family attributed much of what happened to subsequent members to the trauma that radiated outward from the events of 1977. Mickey Hughes killed himself, in a sense, long before March 9th, through the choices he made and the destruction he caused. What Francine did that night was the last in a long sequence of events that had been set in motion before the marriage even began. The first domestic violence shelter in the United States opened in 1974, 3 years before the fire. By the time Francine went to trial, the battered women's movement was still in its early stages. The concept of battered woman syndrome had been developed by psychologist Lenore Walker and was beginning to enter legal discourse, but it had not yet been accepted in most courtrooms. The Francine Hughes case, and the public response to it and to the burning bed, accelerated the timeline of that acceptance considerably. By 1977, the FBI had already identified spousal abuse as the most underreported crime in the United States. The laws that had consistently failed Francine were not anomalies. They were the norm. Police across the country operated under policies and practices that treated domestic violence as a private matter, that discouraged arrest in domestic situations unless officers had personally witnessed the assault, and that placed the burden of managing an abusive partner almost entirely on the person being abused. The Francine Hughes case, and the national conversation it generated helped make those policies publicly indefensible in a way they had not been before. Francine Wilson died on March 22, 2017, in Layton, Alabama. She was 69 years old. Her death was confirmed by her family. The cause was complications from pneumonia she had developed in late 2016. She had been living quietly in Alabama, known to her neighbours as a retired nurse named Francine Wilson, not as the woman whose story had changed American domestic violence law. Very few people in her daily life knew who she'd been. Her daughter Christy, who was one of the 4 children Francine had driven away from the burning house on March 9, 1977, gave an interview years later in which she described her memory of that night and of growing up in the aftermath of it. She said that raising children in the 1970s with an abuser was not the same world as today, that the options available were not what they are now, that her mother had done what she felt she had to do with the tools and the resources that existed at the time. She did not elaborate beyond that. The children of Francine and Mickey Hughes grew up carrying something that no child should have to carry, and most of them did not speak extensively about it publicly. What Francine Hughes left behind was not a legacy she would have chosen. She left behind 4 children who grew up watching their father abuse their mother for their entire childhoods. She left behind a legal and social landscape that changed in part because of what she had done and what had been done to her. She left behind a film that millions of people watched and that flooded hotlines with calls from women who had never told anyone what was happening to them. She left behind a burned house in Dansville, Michigan, and the ash of the school books Mickey made her burn the same night he died. The next case involves a young woman in Springfield, Missouri, who spent her entire childhood in a wheelchair she did not need, diagnosed with diseases she did not have, by a mother who was slowly destroying her for sympathy and attention until the daughter found a way to make it stop. Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and Dee Dee Blanchard. Claudine Blanchard, known to everyone as Dee Dee, was found stabbed to death in her bedroom in Springfield, Missouri on June 14, 2015. She was 48 years old. Her body had been there for several days before anyone checked on her. The discovery came after a Facebook post appeared on the shared account she ran with her daughter Gypsy Rose that read, "That bitch is dead." A second post followed shortly after, describing a sexual act, written in a register completely unlike anything that had ever appeared on the account before. Neighbours and online followers who had been following Dee Dee and Gypsy Rose's story for years were alarmed. The account had always shown the same thing: a devoted mother caring for her severely ill daughter, a girl in a wheelchair with leukemia, muscular dystrophy, vision and hearing impairments, seizures, and developmental delays that Dee Dee said left her with the mental capacity of a 7-year-old. People had donated money to them. Habitat for Humanity had built them a house. They had met country music star Miranda Lambert. They had been given a trip to Disney World. The community of Springfield had embraced them as a symbol of a mother's selfless love. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was not sick. She never had been. She could walk. She could eat. Her mind worked perfectly. Her salivary glands had been surgically removed because her mother had convinced doctors they needed to be. She had been made to use a feeding tube she did not need. She had been prescribed medications for conditions she did not have. She had spent her entire childhood and young adult life sitting in a wheelchair with her head shaved, being presented to the world as a dying girl by the woman who was supposed to protect her. The man who stabbed Dee Dee Blanchard was Nicholas Godejohn, Gypsy Rose's boyfriend, whom she had met on a Christian dating website. Gypsy Rose had supplied the knife. She had hidden in the bathroom while Godejohn committed the killing. The two of them had then taken a bus to Godejohn's home in Big Bend, Wisconsin, where they were arrested 2 days after the body was discovered. Gypsy Rose Blanchard pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 2016 and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. She was released on parole on December 28, 2023, after serving 8.5 years. Nicholas Godejohn was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dee Dee Blanchard had been destroying her daughter for 23 years. What follows is the account of how she did it, why nobody stopped her, and how it ended. The next section covers who Dee Dee Blanchard was, the origins of her behaviour, and the early years of Gypsy Rose's life under her control. Claudine Petra was born on May 3, 1967, in Chack Bay, Louisiana. People who knew her as a child and young woman described her as troubled, prone to petty theft, and difficult in ways that were hard to pin down precisely. Her own family suspected her of having been responsible for the deaths of family members over the years, though none of those suspicions were ever proven or formally investigated. Her mother died in 1997. Family members have expressed privately in the years since Dee Dee's own death that they believe Dee Dee may have been involved, though again, nothing was ever established. What was established after her death and the investigation that followed was that Dee Dee Blanchard had a psychological condition called factitious disorder imposed on another. It was previously known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. The condition involves a caregiver, almost always a parent, fabricating or inducing illness in a person in their care in order to receive attention, sympathy, and validation from medical professionals, family members, and the broader community. The caregiver is not making a mistake. They are deliberately creating suffering in another person for their own benefit. Dee Dee became pregnant at 23 by a 17-year-old named Rod Blanchard. They married and had a daughter, Gypsy Rose, on July 27, 1991. The marriage did not last. Rod and Dee Dee separated, and Dee Dee became Gypsy Rose's sole caregiver. Rod had limited contact with his daughter in the years that followed. Dee Dee controlled the visits and was always present when they occurred. Rod later said he always felt something was off but could never identify what it was. He was not alone in that. Within the first few months of Gypsy Rose's life, Dee Dee began telling doctors that she was sick. She told them the infant had sleep apnea. She said the baby was not breathing normally at night. As Gypsy grew, the list of claimed conditions expanded. By the time Gypsy was 8 years old, Dee Dee had told various medical professionals that her daughter had leukemia, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, chromosomal disorders, vision impairments, hearing impairments, and a brain injury sustained at birth that had left her with the cognitive development of a 7-year-old. None of these things were true. Dee Dee moved between doctors frequently, finding new physicians when existing ones became too questioning. She told them that Gypsy's medical records had been lost in Hurricane Katrina, a claim that was impossible to verify and that conveniently erased any paper trail that might have raised doubts. She shaved Gypsy's head to simulate the hair loss associated with chemotherapy. She put Gypsy in a wheelchair. She put a feeding tube in her and made her use it. She gave her medications for conditions she did not have. She supervised every medical appointment, answered questions on Gypsy's behalf, and controlled every interaction her daughter had with the outside world. Gypsy grew up believing she was sick. When you are a child, and every adult in your life, every doctor, every nurse, every neighbour, every charity worker is telling you that you are ill and that your mother is saving you, you believe it. Gypsy said in later interviews that she had gone along with what her mother told her because there was no framework available to her to think otherwise. She knew she could walk, she knew she could eat, but her mother had explanations for that too, and the explanations were always delivered in a context of medical authority that a child could not challenge. The next section covers how the deception was maintained, the moments when it almost unravelled, and the period in which Gypsy Rose began to understand what was being done to her. The deception was not subtle in retrospect. Several medical professionals over the years had doubts. A paediatric neurologist named Dr. Flasterstein examined Gypsy in 2007 and wrote in his notes that he believed her mother suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy. He noted that Gypsy could walk independently and that her supposed diagnoses did not match what he observed clinically. He did not report his suspicions to Child Protective Services. He later said he believed he did not have enough evidence. Flasterstein found out about Dee Dee's murder in 2015 when a former nurse emailed him a news report. His response, as quoted in subsequent reporting, was, "Poor Gypsy. She suffered all those years and for no reason." Another doctor reported suspected abuse to Child Protective Services in 2009 after he also could not find evidence of the conditions Dee Dee claimed were present. 2 caseworkers visited the Blanchard home. They found nothing out of the ordinary and closed the case. The system that was supposed to catch this kind of abuse failed repeatedly, not because the signs were invisible, but because the nature of the deception exploited specific weaknesses, the deference of medical professionals to parental accounts, the lack of centralised medical record systems that would have revealed the pattern across multiple doctors and hospitals, and the social presentation of Dee Dee as a saint. She had constructed over years a public image of herself as the most devoted mother imaginable. That image made skepticism feel cruel. The financial dimension of the deception was significant. Dee Dee received charitable donations from multiple organisations over the years. She received a house from Habitat for Humanity. She took Gypsy on trips funded by Make-A-Wish and similar organisations. She received government disability payments. The fiction of Gypsy's illness was, among other things, a revenue stream. Gypsy began questioning her situation around 2010 when she was 19 years old, though Dee Dee had told everyone she was 14. At a science fiction convention that year, Gypsy connected briefly with other attendees and experienced a version of ordinary social interaction that made her realise viscerally that her life was not normal. She'd been kept so isolated that even a brief taste of ordinary human contact was revelatory. She began, cautiously, to test the limits of what she'd been told about herself. She discovered she could walk without difficulty. She'd always known this on some level, but articulating it, even to herself, was a process. She had been told for so long that she needed the wheelchair that the chair had become part of her identity. She tried, on one occasion, to walk to a neighbour's house and asked to be taken to a hospital so that doctors could confirm she was not sick. Dee Dee found out and punished her by chaining her to her bed with dog leashes and handcuffs. The physical abuse was a component of the control that the public account of the case often underemphasises. Dee Dee beat Gypsy. She chained her. She controlled what she ate, who she spoke to, what she wore, and what she was permitted to believe about herself. The medical abuse was the most documented element of the case, but it existed alongside a pattern of physical domination that would be recognisable in any other context as severe child abuse. In 2012, Gypsy found the internet. She began creating secret online accounts, accessing them when Dee Dee was asleep. She began talking to people. She began, slowly, building an understanding of her situation that had not been available to her before. She found information about Munchausen syndrome by proxy on prison computers, she later said, and recognised her mother in every symptom. She began looking for a way out. In December 2012, she met Nicholas Godejohn on a Christian dating website. He was from Big Bend, Wisconsin. He had a diagnosis of autism and significant psychological difficulties of his own. Gypsy told him about her life. She told him about her mother. She told him she needed to escape. The next section covers the planning of Dee Dee's murder. The night of June 14th, 2015, the arrest of Gypsy Rose and Godejohn, and the legal proceedings that followed. The relationship between Gypsy Rose and Nicholas Godejohn developed over 3 years before the murder. They communicated online and by phone in the hours when Dee Dee was asleep. They met in person on at least one occasion, when Godejohn visited Springfield while Dee Dee believed Gypsy was asleep, and Gypsy slipped out to meet him at a nearby movie theatre. The plan to kill Dee Dee was not formed overnight. It developed gradually over the course of the relationship. Gypsy has described the decision as coming from a place of desperation rather than calculation. She saw no other way out. She had tried to leave and been physically restrained. She had no money, no identification documents in her own name, no ability to access the outside world independently. The documents Dee Dee controlled listed Gypsy's age as younger than she actually was. Gypsy did not even know her real birth date with certainty for much of her life. She asked Godejohn to kill her mother. He agreed. On the night of June 14th, 2015, Godejohn arrived at the Blanchard home in Springfield. Gypsy let him in. She gave him a knife and went to the bathroom where she waited. She later said she put her fingers in her ears so she would not have to hear what was happening. Godejohn went to Dee Dee's bedroom where she was sleeping and stabbed her multiple times. According to court documents, she was stabbed 17 times. Gypsy came out of the bathroom. The two of them gathered their things. They took a bus to Godejohn's home in Big Bend, Wisconsin. The following day, Gypsy posted on the Facebook account she had shared with her mother. She wrote the posts that alarmed Dee Dee's followers and ultimately led to the discovery of the body. Police found Dee Dee's body on June 15, 2015, 5 days after she was killed. She was found in her bed. The house was described by investigators as having an overall appearance of normalcy, which, given the nature of what had been happening inside it for 23 years, was perhaps fitting. Gypsy Rose and Nicholas Godejohn were arrested in Big Bend, Wisconsin, on June 16, 2015. Gypsy was found able to walk without assistance. Sheriff Jim Arnott of Greene County, who held a press conference after the arrest, told reporters, "Things are not always as they appear." He described the case as surrounded by mystery and public deception. Even the police, encountering the reality that Gypsy was not disabled, had to process the inversion of everything that had been publicly presented about her. The legal proceedings separated quickly along lines that reflected the different situations of the two defendants. Gypsy was offered a plea deal by Greene County prosecutor Dan Patterson, who cited the abuse she had suffered as a factor in the decision to pursue a lesser charge. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in July 2016 and was sentenced to 10 years in prison at the Chillicothe Correctional Center in Missouri. She did not speak to the media between her arrest and her sentencing. Her first major public interview came after the plea, when she spoke to BuzzFeed reporter Michelle Dean. Godejohn did not receive a plea deal. He was charged with first-degree murder. His trial took place in November 2018. Gypsy testified against him. Prosecutors argued that Godejohn had been motivated by a sexual interest in violence and a desire to be with Gypsy rather than purely by a wish to free her from abuse. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated in Missouri. The next section covers the aftermath of the case, Gypsy Rose's time in prison and release, and what the Blanchard case revealed about the failures of the medical and child welfare systems. Gypsy Rose Blanchard served 8.5 years at the Chillicothe Correctional Center. By every account, she was a model prisoner. She completed her GED. She worked. She engaged with prison programs. She described prison, in an interview with ABC News that aired in January 2018, as feeling freer than her life with her mother had felt. She said that in prison she was allowed to walk, allowed to eat, allowed to have friends. The contrast she was drawing was not rhetorical. It reflected her literal experience. Incarceration had given her more basic human freedom than her childhood had. The case generated an extraordinary amount of media attention in the years between her arrest and her release. The HBO documentary Mommy Dead and Dearest aired in 2017. The Hulu series The Act, a fictionalized account of the case starring Joey King as Gypsy and Patricia Arquette as Dee Dee, aired in 2019. A Lifetime film, Love You to Death, also aired in 2018. Gypsy objected publicly to the act, stating that it used her name and story without her consent and contained inaccuracies. She announced legal action against the show's creators. She was released on parole on December 28, 2023, 3 years before her scheduled release date. She left the Chillicothe Correctional Center in the early morning hours. She was 32 years old. It was, by any reasonable measure, the first morning of a life that she had never previously been permitted to have. She had never lived independently. She had never made her own medical decisions. She had never held a job or managed money or chosen where to live. She was walking out of prison into a version of adulthood that most people navigate in their late teens and early 20s. In the months following her release, she gave numerous interviews, appeared in a Lifetime docuseries called The Prison Confessions of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and published an ebook titled Released. She married Ryan Anderson, a man she had met while incarcerated shortly before her release. The marriage became publicly troubled in early 2024, and the two separated. She subsequently reconnected with Ken Urker, a man she'd known before her imprisonment. In late 2024, she announced that she was pregnant. She gave birth to a daughter in 2025. The questions raised by the Blanchard case about the medical and child welfare systems have not been fully resolved. Multiple doctors examined Gypsy over the years and failed to identify the abuse, or identified it and did not act. The doctor who wrote Munchausen syndrome by proxy in Gypsy's chart in 2007 did not report it. The Child Protective Services visit in 2009 was closed without meaningful intervention. The charitable organisations that gave money and resources to Dee Dee did so based entirely on her own account of Gypsy's condition, without independent medical verification. Dr. Flasterstein, the neurologist who had correctly identified the abuse in 2007, reflected publicly after the case became known on what he wished he had done differently. A child abuse expert, Mark Feldman, was critical of the way the case was subsequently covered, arguing that Flasterstein had failed in his legal obligation to report suspected abuse, and that the framing of him as a hero in some media coverage was inappropriate. The broader lesson the medical community drew from the case was about the systemic vulnerability created by the combination of parental authority, medical fragmentation, and the absence of centralized record systems. Dee Dee had been able to move between providers, erase paper trails, and invoke the complexity of Gypsy's supposed conditions as a barrier to questioning. A system in which a parent can present a child to dozens of different medical professionals over 20 years without any of them seeing the full picture is a system with a structural problem that a single, attentive doctor cannot solve. Gypsy Rose Blanchard has been public about her desire to use her story to raise awareness about Munchausen syndrome by proxy, now formally classified as factitious disorder imposed on another. She's described the condition and its impact carefully, making a distinction between Dee Dee as a person and Dee Dee as a product of a psychological disorder that drove her to destroy her own child. She's expressed something that is not quite forgiveness and not quite understanding, but something in between. An acknowledgement that her mother was, in some clinical sense, not operating from the same framework as a person without the disorder, alongside an equally clear acknowledgement that this explanation does not reduce what was done to her. She said in one interview, "I think she would have been the perfect mom for someone who was actually sick." Dee Dee Blanchard spent 23 years constructing a false version of her daughter's body and then presenting that version to the world. She received sympathy, money, praise, and a house. She received everything she was seeking. What she built in the end was a daughter who'd been so thoroughly imprisoned in the fiction that the only exit Gypsy could find was through a knife and a boyfriend and a bathroom, where she put her fingers in her ears and waited. Gypsy Rose is free. Nicholas Godejohn will die in prison. Dee Dee Blanchard is buried in Louisiana. The next case involves two brothers in Beverly Hills who walked into their parents' den on a Sunday evening in August 1989, armed with shotguns, and killed their father and mother in a house that had once belonged to both Michael Jackson and Elton John, and whose claim that their father had been sexually abusing them for years would divide the country for decades. Eric and Lyle Menendez and José Menendez was born in Cuba in 1944 and came to the United States as a teenager with nothing. He built himself into exactly the kind of man the American dream promised was possible. Driven, relentless, successful in ways that were visible and measurable. By the summer of 1989, he was a senior executive at Live Entertainment, a film and home video company based in Los Angeles. He had a 14-room mansion on Elm Drive in one of the most expensive blocks in Beverly Hills, a house that had at different times been home to both Michael Jackson and Elton John. He had a wife, Mary Louise, known as Kitty, and 2 sons, Lyle, who was 21, and Eric, who was 18. From the outside, the Menendez family was a picture of achievement. On the evening of Sunday, August 20th, 1989, Lyle and Eric Menendez walked into the den of that house carrying loaded Mossberg 12-gauge shotguns. Jose and Kitty were watching The Spy Who Loved Me on television. What happened in the next several minutes left both parents dead. Jose was shot 6 times. Kitty was shot 10 times. She had been trying to crawl away from the room when the final shot was fired into her face at close range. Lyle called 911 shortly afterward. He was screaming. He told the operator that someone had killed his parents. He said he and his brother had come home and found them. The brothers then drove to a movie theatre, went to a restaurant, and eventually returned to the house where police were waiting. The story they told that night, that unknown intruders had murdered their parents, did not hold. Within months, both brothers had confessed in therapy sessions that they were responsible. The confession made its way to police through the therapist's girlfriend. Both brothers were arrested in March 1990. What followed was one of the most complicated and publicly debated criminal cases in American history. The brothers admitted they had done it. The question that occupied 2 trials, 3 decades of incarceration, and an ongoing legal battle that is still not resolved as of 2025 was why. The next section covers the background of Jose Menendez, the family dynamic inside the Elm Drive mansion, and the abuse allegations that the brothers put at the centre of their defence. Jose Menendez was, by all accounts, a man of extraordinary drive and equally extraordinary control. He had come to the United States from Cuba as a teenager, earned an economics degree from Southern Illinois University, and climbed through corporate America with a speed and aggression that impressed and intimidated people in equal measure. He ran the North American operations of the car rental company Hertz. He moved to RCA Records, where he was credited with signing major acts including Duran Duran, the Eurythmics, and the Puerto Rican boy band Menudo. He eventually moved into film and home video, becoming a senior executive at Live Entertainment. He brought the same intensity he applied to business to his family. Lyle and Eric were both pushed hard. Lyle was expected to excel academically and in business. Eric was pushed in tennis, where he showed genuine talent and reached a national ranking as a junior player. Their father attended their matches and their academic events and their business presentations. He had opinions about everything they did, and he expressed those opinions without restraint. People who knew the family from the outside described Jose as demanding but invested, a man who pushed his sons because he wanted them to succeed. Behind closed doors, the brothers have consistently offered a different account. Lyle Menendez testified that his father subjected him to mistreatment, beginning when he was 6 years old, continuing until around age 8. Eric Menendez testified that similar mistreatment began in his early childhood and persisted without interruption. He stated that at 18, shortly before the deaths, it was still occurring. Both brothers maintained that their mother was aware of this dynamic and failed to intervene, and that she also subjected them to physical and emotional hardship. The accounts they provided were specific and thorough. They described years of difficult experiences, unwanted physical contact, and a family environment where their father's control was absolute. They portrayed their mother as sometimes directly involved and other times complicit through her silence. They described a family in which the public image of success was constructed over a private reality of sustained harm. Prosecutors rejected these claims entirely. They argued the abuse allegations were fabricated after the fact to provide cover for a killing that was motivated by greed. Jose Menendez had a personal estate valued at approximately $14 million at the time of his death. In the weeks after the murders, Lyle and Eric spent significant amounts of money: Rolex watches, cars, real estate investments, tennis coaching. Prosecutors pointed to the spending spree as evidence that the brothers had killed their parents for the inheritance and had invented the abuse narrative to escape accountability. The brothers' position has never changed across more than 35 years. They have maintained consistently that they killed their parents because they believed their parents were going to kill them to prevent the truth about the mistreatment from being exposed. Lyle testified that in the days before the deaths, he had confronted their father about the conduct involving Eric. He said his father's response to the confrontation made him believe that he and his brother were going to be killed to keep the secret. The brothers said they bought the shotguns in response to that threat. In 2023, new evidence entered the picture. A sworn affidavit was submitted by Roy Rossello, a former member of Menudo, the boy band that Jose had been involved with during his time at RCA Records. Rossello stated that Jose Menendez had committed a serious assault against him when he was approximately 14 years old. This was the first time a third party had come forward with an allegation of sexual abuse against Jose Menendez that was independent of the brothers' own claims. The affidavit was included in a habeas corpus petition filed by the brothers' attorneys. Also included in the petition was a letter that Eric had written to a cousin approximately 8 months before the murders. The letter described the abuse in terms that were consistent with what Eric would later testify to at trial. The letter had not been available at the first trial. Its existence corroborated the cousin's earlier testimony, which some jurors at the first trial had found credible, but which had been dismissed by others as rehearsed. The next section covers the investigation following the murders, the discovery of the brothers' confessions, and their arrest in March 1990. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, investigators focused initially on Jose Menendez's business dealings. He had been involved in lawsuits and had rumoured connections through his business operations to figures with organised crime ties. The possibility that the killings were professional was treated seriously in the early weeks of the investigation. Lyle and Eric were present throughout, cooperating with investigators, presenting themselves as grieving sons trying to help solve their parents' murder. The timeline of their behaviour in the weeks that followed complicated that presentation. Lyle bought a Porsche. He invested in a restaurant in Princeton, New Jersey. He paid for an expensive tennis coach. Eric hired a personal tennis coach and paid him $40,000. They purchased Rolex watches. The spending was not hidden. It was visible and it was fast. Investigators noted it and filed it away. In October 1989, Eric went to his therapist, a psychologist named Jerome Oziel, and in a session that Oziel recorded confessed that he and Lyle had killed their parents. The confession was detailed. Eric cited their father's domineering behaviour and a fear of disinheritance as part of the motivation, according to Oziel's notes from that period. Lyle subsequently came to Oziel's office, and the situation became significantly more complicated. Lyle allegedly threatened Oziel during one of those interactions, a threat that Oziel's girlfriend at the time, Judalyn Smith, later described to police. In March 1990, Smith contacted the Beverly Hills Police Department. She told them about the taped confessions. Police obtained a search warrant, recovered the tapes, and arrested Lyle Menendez outside the Elm Drive mansion on March 8, 1990. Eric, who was in Israel for a tennis tournament, was informed of his brother's arrest and flew back to the United States. He turned himself in 3 days later. Both brothers were held without bail. The question of whether the taped confessions were admissible became a prolonged legal battle. Doctor-patient confidentiality is a protected legal privilege in California, but the protection has limits. Oziel argued that Lyle's alleged threat to him created an exception under California law because the threat constituted a disclosure made to prevent a crime. Judge James Albrecht ruled in August 1990 that most of the tapes were admissible on those grounds. The ruling was appealed. The California Supreme Court upheld the admissibility of most of the tapes in August 1992. A grand jury indicted both brothers on 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances in December 1992. The special circumstances designation meant the brothers were potentially eligible for the death penalty. It also meant the case was going to trial at the highest level of seriousness that California law permitted. The next section covers the first trial, the televised testimony, the hung juries, and the second trial that produced the convictions. The first trial of Eric and Lyle Menendez began in July 1993. It was televised live on court TV. Each brother had a separate jury. The defense admitted from the beginning that the brothers had killed their parents. The entire case turned on why. The brothers took the stand. What they described, over days of televised testimony, watched by millions of people across the country, was a childhood of sustained sexual and physical abuse at the hands of their father, with their mother either participating or failing to intervene. Lyle testified that he had been abused from the age of 6. Eric testified that the abuse had never stopped and was ongoing at the time of the murders. Both brothers wept on the stand. Both described specific incidents in graphic detail. The country watched and divided. A significant portion of the viewing public found the testimony credible. The details were specific, consistent, and delivered in a way that many observers found impossible to fabricate. Mental health professionals who appeared on news programs during the trial described the brothers' accounts as consistent with documented patterns of how abuse survivors behave and disclose. Others found the testimony unconvincing, noting the brothers' spending in the weeks after the murders and arguing that the elaborate abuse narrative had been constructed to escape consequences for a killing motivated by money. The defense used a legal argument called imperfect self-defense. Under California law at the time, imperfect self-defense applied when a defendant genuinely believed they needed to use deadly force to protect themselves, even if that belief was not objectively reasonable. If the jury accepted that the brothers genuinely believed their parents were going to kill them, imperfect self-defense would reduce the charge from first-degree murder to voluntary manslaughter. The prosecution argued that the abuse claims were fabricated and that the killing was premeditated and financially motivated. They pointed to the purchase of the shotguns 2 days before the murders, the setting up of alibis, and the spending spree that followed. They argued that 2 young men from a wealthy Beverly Hills family who claimed their father had been abusing them had access to resources, including money, lawyers, and the ability to leave the house, that a genuine abuse victim does not typically have, and that the failure to use any of those resources before resorting to murder undermined the credibility of the self-defense claim. Both juries deadlocked. They could not reach unanimous verdicts on murder or manslaughter. Individual jurors who spoke to the press afterward described the jury rooms as deeply divided, with some members finding the abuse testimony credible and others rejecting it entirely. The mistrials were declared in January 1994. The second trial began in October 1995. The judge made a critical evidentiary ruling that significantly changed the landscape. Much of the abuse evidence that had been presented in the first trial was excluded. The second trial was held before a single jury. Without the extensive abuse testimony that had been presented the first time, the defense had significantly less to work with. The jury in the second trial convicted both brothers of first-degree murder with special circumstances in March 1996. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in July 1996. They were separated and sent to different prisons. Lyle went to Mule Creek State Prison. Eric went to a different facility. They would not be housed together again until 2018, when Lyle was transferred to Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, where Eric was already incarcerated. Both brothers married while in prison. Lyle married twice. Eric married a woman named Tammy in 1999 through a pen pal arrangement and remains married to her. The next section covers the decades of appeals, the new evidence that emerged in 2023, the resentencing in 2025, and the parole hearings that denied both brothers their freedom. For the first 2 decades of their incarceration, the Menendez brothers' legal situation did not change in any significant way. They appealed. The appeals failed. They applied for parole and were denied at initial review stages. The case occasionally resurfaced in media coverage but was not generating the kind of sustained public attention that might have produced political pressure for a reconsideration. That changed in the early 2020s, when a new generation of true crime consumers encountered the case through podcasts, YouTube videos, and social media. Young people who had not been born when the murders occurred watched the first trial testimony, considered the abuse allegations in the context of a 2020s understanding of child sexual abuse and trauma, and reached very different conclusions than the 1996 jury had. The case became a significant presence on TikTok in particular, where content analysing the trial testimony and arguing for the brothers' guilt or innocence generated millions of views. In September 2024, Netflix released Monsters, the Lyle and Eric Menendez story, a fictional dramatisation of the case created by Ryan Murphy. The series was controversial immediately. Eric Menendez wrote publicly that the show contained horrible and blatant lies, and that Murphy had constructed a narrative based on belief systems about male abuse victims that the brothers felt were damaging and false. Murphy was publicly dismissive of the criticism. The series drew enormous viewership regardless of the controversy, and it brought the case to an entirely new audience. 1 week after the Monsters series launched, Netflix released a separate documentary on the brothers. The combination of the two productions generated a level of public attention and advocacy for the brothers that had not existed before. In October 2024, Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon announced that his office was recommending the brothers be resentenced. He stated that his office had a moral and ethical obligation to review the evidence, and that the new evidence, including the Rossello affidavit and the letter Eric had written before the murders, was significant. He recommended the brothers be resentenced to 50 years to life, which would make them immediately eligible for parole given the time they had already served, and California laws governing parole eligibility for people who committed crimes before the age of 26. In February 2025, Gascon was succeeded as district attorney by Nathan Hochman. Hochman filed a response to the brothers' habeas petition that was significantly less supportive than his predecessor's position had been. He urged the court to deny the petition, arguing that the new evidence was not strong enough to warrant overturning the conviction. The legal situation became more complicated than it had appeared when Gascon made his announcement. In May 2025, a Los Angeles Superior Court judge resentenced both brothers to 50 years to life. The resentencing meant they were now eligible for parole. It did not guarantee release. It transferred the question of their freedom from the courts to the parole board. Both brothers appeared before separate parole panels in August 2025. The hearings drew significant public attention. Kim Kardashian, who had visited both brothers in prison and written a public op-ed calling for their release, attended portions of the proceedings. Family members of both brothers spoke in support of their release. Family members of Kitty Menendez, including her niece Diane Hernandez and her sister Joan Vandermolen, spoke in opposition. Relatives of Jose Menendez, including his niece Ana Maria Baralt, spoke in support of release, stating that if the case had been heard today with current understanding of abuse and trauma, the sentencing would have been very different. Lyle Menendez was denied parole on August 22, 2025. Eric Menendez was denied parole on August 21, 2025. Both denials were for 3 years, meaning neither brother will be eligible for another parole hearing until 2028 at the earliest. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation confirmed both denials in brief official statements. Both brothers remain incarcerated at Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. Lyle is 57 years old. Eric is 54. They have been in prison for 35 years. They have maintained, across all of those years and through all of the legal proceedings and the public attention and the denials, that they killed their parents because they believed their parents were going to kill them, and that behind the doors of the house on Elm Drive, the family that looked like a picture of success was doing something to them that they could not survive. Whether that is true, whether Jose Menendez did what his sons say he did, is not something the legal system has definitively resolved. What the legal system has resolved, twice, is that Lyle and Eric Menendez killed their parents. The question of why they did it, and what that means for how long they should remain in prison, is still being answered. If you enjoyed this deep dive into killers who are murdered by their own victims, make sure to subscribe. I will see you in the next video.